Yo, what is up guys, Grim here, and in today's video I want to talk about a new edition coming in Forbidden Sanctum that is guaranteed to shake up the endgame economy and farming strategies, and that is the Fracturing Orb. To understand why the Fracturing Orb is going to be such a big deal, we first need to understand what it's going to be used for and, of course, what it's replacing. So the Fracturing Orb is being implemented in place of the current way to access fracturing items, and that is a Harvest Craft. So the Harvest Craft currently costs around 5 to 6 divines in the economy and requires a ton of pink life force as well as an Ashabi white life force item. Now this is pretty damn inaccessible even for the highest level of players and is very difficult to get your hands on in solo self-found. Now the very nature of this orb and this craft means that you're gonna need on average at least 4 of them to get the exact outcome you want on average. If we take a look at the Fracturing Orb, it says it fractures an item with at least 4 modifiers and it'll lock one of them in place. So if you wanted to fracture one specific mod, you'll need 4 on average. So to fracture an item of your choice right now in the current economy, it's going to cost you around 20-ish divines just in Harvest Life Force, which is quite absurd and definitely puts a very high barrier to entry on using this mechanic or crafting any items that require it. So if the Fracturing Orb makes this at all more accessible, it's going to be a massive deal. Now, in patch 3.20, the new Fracturing Orb is essentially obviously inheriting the effects of this Harvest Craft, and it will be replacing it, freeing up all the life force that you're used to using in Harvest for other things, and also hopefully becoming more accessible at the same time. Alright, so we understand that fracturing is used by high-end players quite a lot, and it costs a hefty sum. But I wanted to explain a little bit why fracturing is just really so powerful for everybody if it's an accessible mechanic we can all use and get our hands on. So this is my character from Lake of Kalandra, which I min-maxed quite a little bit here, and every single one of my items that is not unique or synthesized is actually a fractured item, and that is because it's by far one of the most powerful crafting mechanics currently in Path of Exile. If you are able to use non-Shaper, Elder, and Conqueror influence items in your build, it will be something you want to look into in the new league and all future leagues. Now, let me go through a little bit why it's so powerful. So if you take these gloves, for example, which currently have, a good amount of modifiers on them, you'll notice here that we do have a fractured modifier. By locking in the spell suppression on my gloves, I'm guaranteeing at least 1 modifier on my item, which I want to be for sure. Now, in addition to that, you can also guarantee modifiers fairly easily in combination with fracturing, like through ways like Essence or through Harvest. So using Essences, you can guarantee a second modifier 100% of the time. Just by using 1 Essence, you can use Deafening or a Shrieking. Now you have a 2 modifier item, which is pretty damn good. Now, one of the cool things about Essences is they're pretty accessible in softcore trade, especially if you're using Screaming or Shrieking, and they're not too bad to get in solo self-found either. Now you can roll those Essences guaranteeing 1 mod and having your fractured mod until you hit another modifier that you're interested in, giving you a total of 3 mods. You can then hopefully, in theory, maybe lock those in with a benchcraft if you've got a couple divines spare and use an unveil using Ashling from Betrayal. That's giving you 4 modifiers guaranteed now. And then, of course, you can also use a benchcraft, giving you a 5 modifier item all in pretty much no RNG. It's all locked in. Yes, your Ashling modifier might take a few tries, but overall, that is kind of where crafting is at right now. It's very, very easy to guarantee 5 modifiers on an item if you can get the fracture that you need. Now, this is particularly evident and heavily used for weapons, because weapons are traditionally one of the hardest things to craft, and they're also what dictate the power level of a lot of attack-based builds. So this bow I'm using here is a little bit of an infamous craft for a lot of players who want to play a high-end bow build. And one of the most expensive parts is getting the +2 arrow bow fracture. Now, this is, if made more accessible, maybe open the way to some other people maybe be able to play some really cool bow builds. But it's not just bows that people want to fracture. Fracturing stuff like scepters to get +1, staves to kind of make a cool staff. You can also fracture stuff like claws. There's tons of things that people want to fracture. Maybe +1 arrow on a quiver. Everything is available to fracture, and people will do that if the mechanic is more accessible. It's fair to say that fracturing is by far one of the most powerful mechanics in Path of Exile currently, and if more people gain access to it, well, we've got a pretty interesting scenario on our hands. Alright, so I'm sure everybody wants to be slamming a ton of fracturing orbs into all kinds of items now for their fresh new build on League Start. So the question is going to be, how accessible are these things? Because that's going to really determine what they're going to be used on. If they're so common that there's tons of them floating around and you can buy a stack of 20 of them without spending too much money, well, then you're going to be able to fracture every single item you want in the game. You'll be able to get a fracture of specifically what you want on any base, however, whenever you want, and it's going to be great. Now, obviously, on the other end of the extreme, this is a very powerful mechanic, and it's entirely possible they make these things incredibly rare. So rare, in fact, that they could cost 1 or 2 divines each. That would be the worst scenario, I think, as it would limit the mechanic again to, the ultra high end. Now, of course, it might be even more expensive than that. Who knows? It's really going to come down to the scarcity of the fragments from the mechanic that this orb drops from. Harbinger. Now, what is good though, however, is that even if they're super duper rare, it's still going to benefit everybody. And even if they're super duper common, again, it'll benefit people even more. Now, this is because of the impact this orb is going to have on the economy. And that's going to require taking a bit of a deeper look. Let's go in. So in order to understand the impact, let's cover the 2 scenarios I just explained. We'll start off with the one where they're super duper rare, because that's obviously the worst case scenario, but it is also not too bad for everybody. So Harbinger, fortunately, is one of the most accessible mechanics in the game right now for Path of Exile to farm. And that's because it's such an old mechanic. It's been in the game since they introduced Elder, which is a long time. And it's also present somewhat in a bunch of other mechanics. So for example, in Legion, you can get Harbinger titled rewards. You can also get Harbinger incubators. In Heist, there's rooms where you can get Harbinger titled rewards. In Delirium, there's a Harbinger Delirium orb, and also rewards from Simulacrum reward Harbinger. So the point is here that there's a ton of different places that you can get these Harbinger fragments from potentially, meaning that just by default, there should be more of these orbs in the economy overall, just because they come from everywhere. To add a few more to that list, which might be potentially interesting, we'll get into this at the end a little bit more. There's also the Harbinger memory, which converts all loot in those memories into Harbinger fragments, as well as stuff like the Beachhead or the Harbinger compass, which makes bosses drop an absolutely ridiculous amount of Harbinger shards. So there's a ton of different angles you can come at farming Harbinger from, which all will potentially give you an opportunity to make a ton of currency. But at the most basic level, Harbinger is, as I mentioned, very accessible. If you take a look at the Atlas passive tree, everyone can get access to at least 1 Harbinger in their maps pretty early on, in white maps. You can guarantee it. And then you can also further juice that up by blocking mechanics if you'd like on the Atlas passive tree. And then if you want to really go the full Monty, you can obviously invest further in it, which I believe most people will be doing in the new league because it'll be so powerful. And you'll be able to pick up stuff like Unspeakable Offensive and, First Wave and things along those lines. Now, why is this good if they're so damn rare? Well, as I mentioned, Harbinger is incredibly easy to farm and very accessible. And if everybody is able to farm them and, have a chance at getting a jackpot drop, of some fracturing shards, that is a pretty big deal because they're guaranteed in every map, they're super accessible, and it's going to be a damn good strategy for Alk and Go gamers. And if you just want to log on, do some maps, farm up some Harbingers, you'll probably be able to make some pretty good progress towards your goals just by, slaying some blue guys. And obviously, if they're in demand and they're super duper high worth, the item will be very, very easy to sell. If there's a world in which the fracturing orb is worth 4 or 5 divines in some crazy universe, well, that's going to feel pretty damn good when you finish that fracturing orb off after a big farming session, which is pretty damn cool. Alright, so let's take a look at the other extreme now. What if they're super duper common, like so common that fracturing orbs like 10 or 20C? Now that would be the dream. Everyone would be able to pick these things up and start fracturing all their items. Stuff like jewels, cluster jewels, pretty much anything but flasks would be on the table and ready to fracture. +2 bows would be on everyone's builds. Everyone would be wearing like basically insane gear, which would be so damn cool. And I really hope that does come to pass. But what does that do to the farming scenario which I described earlier? You know, if these things are super duper cheap because they're so damn common, is that a good outcome? Well, in my opinion, yes, because availability, you know, recombinators prove this, is awesome. But recombinators didn't just prove that. They also proved that accessibility and, you know, having high amounts of these, you know, these resources doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be worthless or hard to sell. So I think that if they're super plentiful, not only is that going to make, you know, most people's experience with Harbinger much more consistent, you know, you can kind of guarantee that you're going to get a certain amount of currency every session if they're super common, because, you know, they'll average out much easier, but you'll also, you know, have a ton more access to them, and you'll also be able to sell them much easier in bulk. Like, you know, instead of like getting 14 shards, you know, over a couple days, you might get 14 orbs over a couple days, which would be super nice, and you can sell the orbs instead of waiting to finish off that big, you know, big ticket item, which would, in my opinion, be the ideal scenario. Now, do I think this is going to be as common as a 20C item or recombinators? Probably not. They are a very powerful orb. However, it is nice to see the two extremes and see that, you know, it is going to be a pretty good scenario either way it goes, and everyone's going to gain a new farming strategy or a number of farming strategies from the introduction of this one orb. Fingers crossed it's super accessible, but, you know, either way it goes, it's looking pretty good. To round out the video, I thought I'd give you guys a few of my farming strategy ideas for the new Harbinger farms, which are inevitably coming, as I alluded to earlier. So the first one I want to talk a little bit about is basically stacking Harbingers alongside the Harbinger compass. So this compass here basically is going to, can we see it? We can see it, okay. Basically going to state that map bosses are accompanied by a mysterious Harbinger, but they also drop currency shards themselves. Now, what is particularly interesting about this compass is that it doesn't obey the normal map boss drop rules. So usually when something says map boss drops, it's basically going to be in one of the bosses. Like if you have like 17,000 bosses in your map, only one of them will drop loot. Now that's not the case for this compass, unless they decide to change it in the new patch, but I don't think they will. All the bosses in the map will drop the currency, which is pretty damn crazy. So if you do a map like City Square, which is really, really good for Harbinger, and you roll up to the boss and slay all 3 of them, you'll get 3 big piles of Harbinger shards, which is going to be pretty damn nice. Which I'm definitely going to be trying out. But of course you want to stack this with other ways to get tons of Harbingers as well, like Gilded Harbinger Scarabs. If you can get your hands on them, they should be much more accessible due to the new 3-to-1 Scarab recipe coming into the game, which is pretty cool. But not only that, you're also going to want to use Harbinger on the map device, which is going to give you even more Harbingers, which of course will also drop additional currency shards because of the compass. And then you can obviously grab stuff like the nudes or like the small passives, which give you more chances of Harbingers, and obviously the currency shards, and you can see this strategy could be kind of getting a little out of control. Now obviously we know that all the bosses drop the currency shards, but what you guys might not know is that there's actually a node on the tree which gives map bosses a 20% chance to be duplicated if possible. So if you roll up into a 3 map boss map and you duplicate them, that's giving you 6 map bosses. Now if I had to kind of ballpark it here, each map boss drops, you know, currency shards equivalent to about 1 Harbinger's worth of shards. So you're essentially getting another 3 or even 6 if you duplicate it, kind of sets of shards here, which is pretty damn insane. Now, if you actually roll the map bosses are duplicated on the map and then also roll the 20% here for enriched entities, I'm not entirely sure what happens. I'll be honest, I haven't tested it, but it might be pretty interesting to see what the results are. Is there a world in which you could get 9 map bosses? Potentially, maybe, I'm not sure, but it definitely does look pretty interesting. So the next thing I wanted to try out for sure is going to be one of the Harbinger memories. So these can get pretty insane, and you can roll these up with a ton of increased item quantity and all sorts of stuff like that. Now the unique thing about the Harbinger memory is it converts all loot drops into the actual currency shards. So it scales pretty much directly with increased item quantity as well as magic find. So if you're magic finding more Harbinger shards, which is pretty damn interesting. And you know, if you're rolling in there with a 6-man group, I have to imagine that's going to impact that number of shards as well. Now, I'm not sure it's going to be the most optimal 6-man farming strategy or anything like that, but you know, stacking magic find 6-man, you know, you could be printing some serious amount of fractured orbs in those memories, man. It could be a pretty interesting experiment to go down and have a look at. Maybe even for solo players, it might be worth looking into. We'll just have to see how rare and expensive the memories end up being. But there's definitely a pretty big carrot on getting those orbs, and if you know they're very expensive, that might be a valid strategy. Now, the last one here is going to be experimenting with alternate sources of Harbinger rewards. So I'm not entirely sure which one will be the best at, you know, kind of providing these. It really depends on how rare the shards are, but it's potentially possible that using something like a Harbinger Delirium Orb might actually be reasonable. Or, you know, in the past, the Harbinger incubators have dropped full Harbinger currency. So you can get a full Harbinger Orb or a full, you know, like, you know, Exalted Orb in some cases and stuff like that. Well, I'm not sure about the Exalted Orb, but the full Harbinger Orb for sure. Maybe you can get a full Fractured Orb from some of these mechanics. And if that's the case, then maybe there's a world in which, you know, farming Legion becomes better or farming Delirium becomes better. And that would be pretty interesting as well. So hopefully you guys have gotten a little bit more excited about the new Fracturing Orb, and you can see the uses for it and the outcome of, you know, even if it's rare or common, it's going to be good for everybody. There's going to be some brand new farming strategies on the table, and they'll be accessible for everybody. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I'll see you guys in the next one. Make sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, or dislike and leave me some feedback if you've got that too. I really appreciate it. Until next time, cheers.